Welcome back to the Guardian Alliance. Today we have another live session, and this one is focused on conflict resolution. All of us in our daily lives experience conflict, whether it comes from family, friends, strangers, just random people that we meet on the street. We have misalignments with other people. We have disagreements. We have buildup of charge. And when we have emotional charge around somebody and that emotional charge is not in coherence with them, or their emotional charge is not in coherence with us, we find a state of conflict arises. So in this live session, what we're going to be covering is some of the energetic roots of conflict. We're going to go beneath the layers of the mental and just the physical experience and actually talk about the energetic emotional field that drives the force of whether we're in coherence or whether we're in conflict with somebody. And through this journey together today, I'm going to share with you some of my personal experiences and some of the recent events in my life that have been teaching me a lot about conflict and about the challenge that we face when we try to resolve that conflict. And we're trying also to keep our own boundaries held and our own beliefs intact. This is one of the greatest challenges each one of us face, is meeting somebody else or coming into a space with somebody else and discovering that no matter how much we want to find some state of resolution, a part of us isn't willing to let go of what feels like is our truth on the inside. And the difficulty in resolving conflict in those situations is actually having the humility and sitting with the place in you that is in this resistant state and giving it enough time, enough energy, and enough compassion and love so that it can finally let go and the conflict can be resolved. You see, the key to resolving conflict is that people don't necessarily have to win. No one has to necessarily be a winner or a loser in a conflict. Actually, what we really just need is understanding and acceptance for wherever we're at, whatever it is that we're experiencing. And that acceptance is going to give us the gift that we need to move past the conflict, get to know other people's perspectives more deeply, and accept aspects of ourselves, both positive aspects of ourselves, where our strengths are, where our truth really is, and also shine a light on our bullshit. So thank you all so much for joining me here today. My name is Adam Apollo. I'm a founder and faculty of the Guardian Alliance, if you haven't been in our sessions together before. And this session is a kickoff of a whole series of new live sessions and new courses that we're going to be releasing this winter and all the way into the spring. Right now, we just turned on a new membership program. And that membership program, for $1.11, you get access to a ton of archived courses and modules and different video and media. And for only $11 for the first month, you can actually get the entire Mastery Ring 1 series of courses in the Guardian Alliance. So you can find out more information about that on this page if you just scroll down and take a look. And I might bring more information up about that later. But since we're here, and since you guys are taking this precious time out of your evening, your day, to join me for this session, let's dive right in. So the first step is, let's look at the 4 stages of conflict resolution. Let's identify the different phases that we go through when we get into a process where conflict begins to arise. And that arising happens in the first stage. That first stage is what we call the origins of the conflict. Now, what is the origin of a conflict? There are many, many, many different things that can cause a conflict to arise, but we're going to touch on some details in different forms of energy that occur prior to a conflict. So we can start to identify not only that a conflict is arising, but actually begin to preemptively sense when a conflict may arise, and begin to actually offer some medicine to change that situation before it actually becomes volatile. The second stage of conflict resolution is what I like to call alignment. Now, during the alignment phase, this is where you're choosing sides. This is where you're picking and really making the decision internally on whether or not you're going to go in alignment with the other person that you may be having a personal conflict with, or in the case of witnessing other people that are in a state of conflict with each other. This is the point where you actually have to decide, how are you going to create an alignment between yourself and both of these people, or with one of these parties, in order to begin to de-escalate and resolve the conflict. So that third stage is what I like to call tempering. This place of the tempering is where you're actually going to work on the conflict. You're actually going to start to either de-escalate the conflict, you're going to start to redirect the conflict, you're going to start to address the fundamental issues in the conflict, and you're going to temper the place of that conflict down until it's no longer something that's dangerous. It becomes something that is a useful tool for learning and for understanding. I like to think of it as being in the forge. The fire is hot, the stuff is burning, you're trying to basically create something new out of this situation, or even just, get out of the danger of the fire literally burning you up. But you need that fire to be able to temper the tool that you're working on. And that tool is going to be a new relationship form. It's going to be a new way of interacting with another person or with other people that are in conflict with each other. Finally, the fourth stage is resolution. This is the phase where you have to bring the energy level back down to a grounded enough space where you can actually move forward from the place of the conflict without the conflict no longer being in existence. This is the time when you're actually cultivating the next phase so that conflict is prevented in the future, and also deepening an understanding of the other person or the group of people so that you can actually come into a much deeper state of coherence with each other. So we're going to cover these 4 stages in today's live session. And just so you guys know, there is a wall down below. We have some shout outs coming in. Mr. Multiverse coming in from Australia, Cliff Waterbury, Kingston, Ontario, Numi from France, Nico from Quebec City, Canada, E. Maquette from Quincy, California, Baker from Littleton, Colorado, and some more communications coming in. Thank you guys so much for being here with me today. It's an honor, as always, to work with you, and I'm excited to be here with you, particularly today, because today I just had some very, very potent experiences today and yesterday, and they are very much related to this specific live session and to the work that we are doing as guardians here on the planet. So I'm going to talk about that in just a minute. But first, let's look at some of the origins of conflict, and that'll lead us right there. One of the first pieces of conflict, one of the first origins that I want to talk about with conflict is looking at what happens when people haven't eaten. You wake up in the morning, you are in a real big hurry, you skip breakfast, and the next thing you know, you're at work, or you're connecting with some other people, or you're at a course or a class or whatever it happens to be, and you've got this little feeling in your stomach. It's that hollow feeling like you're hungry, right? But on an organ level, you're tightening up, you're clenching, you need some food, and people are saying things to you, and you're just not receiving them as well. You're taking them a little more personally. They're destabilizing your emotional field. And suddenly you feel, you react, you respond to somebody, you speak maybe a little bit more tense than normal. You say something that's just, maybe slightly less polite than usual. And in the moment when that happens and that goes on, all of a sudden you find yourself in a conflict. Somebody else is hurt, they're now angry at you, and the next thing you know, you've got to start resolving the situation that you created just because, basically you're hungry, and your body is actually experiencing a chemical response that's similar to as if you were in danger. Now, this happens in other ways, even if you've eaten food. Like, let's say you eat a bunch of sugar, or you drink a big cup of coffee with a lot of caffeine. Caffeine in particular is something that I, in my life, had to identify as a source for a lot of my frustration in my life. When I drink a full cup of a lot of coffee, what I would find is that I'd get like, not just the jitters, but I'd actually get this feeling in my upper belly, right around the area of my liver, that would actually feel like I was angry. It was the feeling of anger and frustration, even if nothing had happened. But because I felt that way in my body, because my body was giving me the signals of frustration, I would tend to actually, respond a little bit more short. I'd be a little more, sharp, a little more intense in how I communicate. And that kind of communication can stimulate conflict. Now, you've probably noticed with other people that may be drinking a lot of coffee or eating a lot of sugar or haven't eaten food, that when you're having a certain conversation with them, you may notice they have that same pattern where you're talking to them and things seem normal, but they're reacting to all these little things that don't seem like a big deal at all. But to them, they're experiencing them from this place that's going on in their physical body, that's experiencing this emotion that is latent because it's actually a chemical response inside their body that's giving them that feeling. Now, emotional feelings in general and just our states of vibration and emotion are absolutely essential to understanding the real roots of where we get into conflicts with other people. Because just as, when we're hungry, there's an emotional charge that's connected to a gland secretion that's going in our bodies during that time, we can also create that same glandular secretion, that same physical experience, that same emotional charge just by the thoughts that we have in our head and by the beliefs that we're holding, and also by just emotions that are coming up within us at any moment in time. And so the hierarchy of flow that we're talking about here is that basically first, it's going on in your mind. Your mind has some thoughts about things, and if you can stabilize and hold a clear space in your mind, and your mind is not, say, stressed about work that you have to do, stressed about time and time limitations, worried that you're going to be late for something and other people are going to judge you, conflicted about a decision that you're going to make in the future or now that you have to make. Any of these kinds of mental pressures, the idea where you're overwhelmed and the experience in your mind is that there's this stack and you just can't get on top of it. And when that stack builds up on you and you have these forms of pressure, they immediately translate down into an emotional experience, and it begins to actually, one way of calling it is inflame your emotional field, where your emotional body is trying to somehow flow energy through these quick, sharp, jagged edges that are expressing out through your mind. And when it does that, your body feels these sharp, jagged edges, and your emotional state becomes one of a lot of frustration, a lot of stress, and again, you have that same high potential for conflict that emerges from this experience. Now, even those things that happen in our minds and the things that are just emotional experiences that, maybe somebody hurt us, maybe somebody said something to us that deeply has affected our emotional bodies, any of the kinds of traumas that we might experience, or even just challenges that we might experience on a mental, emotional, or physical level can all translate to a heightened experience of conflict in our lives. And this is the first place we have to look for conflict, is we have to look at it in ourselves. We have to see if we can find the place where conflict arises in ourselves so that we can become more proficient at resolving conflict inside of us and also inside of other people. Now, it doesn't always work that way. For many of us, we find that our experience in life is that we tend to be resolving conflicts with other people. We see that there's other partners, other people in relationship, there's other friends, there's family members, and we see this conflict between them all the time, while we're in general maybe feeling fine usually. And so we may get really, really good at resolving these conflicts with other people. And we're going to talk more about addressing conflicts with others. But right now, what I really want to address and really want to lay out for you is that if you have developed skills in resolving conflicts between two other people, when the conflict comes home and it's about you, or it's about you and your partner, a lot of times the same tools that maybe you could use in that other situation just don't work here. Your ego is too involved. Your attachments are too great. The risk of being wrong might feel too great. And so it requires a different kind of addressing to deal with the conflicts that are in your personal life. And this weekend, I took a workshop with a woman named Sabanfu Somé. And Sabanfu is of the Dagara tribe of Africa. And she's an African spiritual teacher and leader. And she does these workshops as she travels around the world. And the workshops are called grief rituals. And these grief rituals basically address what is the root of all of the pain and the deepest conflict inside of us. Where do our different issues in our life really come from a fundamental energetic level, on the deepest energetic basis? Well, when we really, really dive into it, and we start to consider and look at our lives through the lens of where are we grieving, where do we have grief that's unexpressed, we begin to see that every place that we've blocked ourselves from expressing an emotion, from expressing grief, from expressing anger, from expressing whatever it is that's going on inside of us, every place that we've blocked that is a place that we've actually started to close down a part of who we are, a part of ourselves. And when we've closed down a part of ourselves, we cannot be our full and complete selves in presence with other people. We tend to take on a little bit of a shell. And our entire society and culture in this time, as we can see, has played out the creation of this shell and the forcing of this shell upon a lot of people in society. For example, as a male, I grew up, and all the time growing up, I dealt with the challenge of other people calling me a wussy, calling me a pussy, calling me a whatever, all of these different names that were basically designed to attack the fact that I had feelings and I was sensitive. And sometimes it really hurt my feelings when people would attack other people or say things to me that were wrong and dishonored who I am. And the feelings inside of me and the feelings inside of most young boys, when they're expressed and in the context of a lot of other young boys growing up in United States, in particular, this is really bad. If they express a lot of emotions, they're considered a wussy, a crybaby, or any of 1,000 other names. And so young boys tend to, over time, begin to look at their own emotions as a dangerous thing to express. And over time, they began trying to close down and block and hide their emotions. They try to put a mask on where they can be hard and they can be strong and nobody can affect them by saying things that are hurtful. Yet the things that are hurtful are said anyway. The pain still comes in. And even the idea that someone's father could call them a wussy, for example, which is unfortunately a traumatic experience for a lot of young boys, creates a wound, a trauma, and that trauma holds grief that is unexpressed. And in time, that grief must be expressed. The emotions of that experience must come out in some way or another. And a lot of times what ends up happening is that the emotional energy stored in that grief comes out in anger, comes out through violence, comes out through acting out in other ways that seem to be more safe than sharing the weakness, so-called weakness, of expressing the emotional grief that you're holding around the situation or the event. Now, this is related to something that I often talk about in other live sessions, and it has to do with the female mooning process. And now women have this other experience where they're shamed often for their blood flow, for their moon cycle, for their menstruation, a natural part of their bodies. And yet some of the world's societies and cultures have somehow put such a shame around that it should be hidden, that no one should know that you're going through a menstruation. And that if you're going to be an effective person in the world, a successful business person or whatever, then that can't come into play. That would make you less than the men that you're working with. And these ideas and the lack of education and consciousness around the sanctity of women's bodies and their lunar cycles, the loss of spirituality focused on the beauty of women's lunar cycles and their mooning process and their bleeding process. The lack of honor of that has created a latent grief within the feminine. And women are often trying to overcome that, but they're oftentimes, having to put things in their bodies or use certain kinds of drugs that would stifle or hold back that flow. And so it exacerbates their need to be seen and their desire to be witnessed by others in the world who can really see and know them and feel them, and for themselves to feel safe and witnessed and honored in their own bodies. And there's a similarity here between these two sides of the polarity, as you may have already intuited or you may have heard me talk about at other times. And the similarity is that women and men are very similar. We have emotional cycles. The moon is the guide of our emotional waves, and we all have different cycles within the moon cycle that drive our energetic and emotional experience and feelings as we go through life. Now, men have to have a period of time during a month where they release their emotions. They release their charge. They got to get it out. This is something that, has been lost in our society, but fortunately comes back in through sometimes, men's circles and small community groups and men's nights where guys get together and they're able to just, riff and, beat on each other in a good way and create a kind of environment where all the men feel safe to express their emotions without being judged. Now, these kinds of things are rare, but it's my hope that more and more people who hear this kind of talk stimulate those kinds of circles in their lives. They find, gender circles to gather with and connect with and commune with so that they can start expressing their emotions. And this is why, for men, it's so important that they also release during this lunar cycle, because if they don't have an emotional release, they don't have a grieving cycle, they don't have a time when they can be vulnerable, when they can be weak, when they can be nurtured, then what happens is they try to make that weakness come out in others. They project their own feelings onto other people and actually will try to hurt them or damage them in some way to see their weakness externally, manifesting that same trauma that's going on inside of them in somebody else. And this is the cycle of trauma and the cycle of grief. And this is how it happens. Dad comes home, he's upset with the kid, he's like, can't deal with his own life. So, he hits his kid or beats him with the belt or whatever for doing something silly and stupid that kids do. And the next thing you know, kids at school, he's not being heard, he's not getting felt. So he decides to make this other kid hear him and feel him. He's going to hear him and feel him, so he's going to take the beating. And this is how the pattern of bullying occurs. And we need to understand this at the very root. And we need to understand this block also in the feminine and the challenge in the feminine of dealing with and honoring their lunar cycle and realizing that inside the feminine, there's a collective field there too. It's not just them. They're also helping to process the emotions and the grief of all the people that they have encountered throughout that month. And if we can't find enough leeway to allow that to happen and allow that to be expressed, then conflict is going to arise. And we need to be prepared for that. We need to be conscious of that, because conflict is sometimes going to come up whether we like it or not. And it's going to come up in all areas of our lives. And a lot of the reason for that, according to Subhamfu Samay, is that a lot of our global societies have lost the capacity to really deeply express our grief, to really release our emotions and really let them flow, and have the space and the container to do so in a way that's healthy for us, that actually improves our health, improves our lives. And so for the past 2 days, yesterday and today, I sat with Subhamfu and a group of about 120 to 150 people from around Asheville, North Carolina. And while some of the people sang and played drums, we went up in waves and we literally just cried and expressed our grief and held space for each other to express that grief. Each person going up to this grief altar had somebody came behind them and held space for them as a guardian for them, so they could express their grief, and nobody's going to judge them, nobody's going to say anything. And everyone was doing it at the same time. And it was one of the most powerful experiences I've had. It was so beautiful. And it was like a deep, deep medicine journey, but the medicine was our own deep inherent sadness. And, the thing that I realized through this ritual was that sometimes you can't even identify what it is that's hurting inside of you. You can't even identify where the pain is really at. And we need time, we need space, we need to give each other the support to allow the kind of container for that to come out. And sometimes that means first just creating the little container that you can just sit in it and you can just feel the crappiness that you feel. We don't want to feel crappy, right? We want to fix it. We want to change it. We want to make it better. We're always trying to make it better for ourselves and for other people. But the truth is that if there's emotion that's not been expressed, if there's grief that hasn't come out, we're not going to make it better. It just needs to come out. And Subhamfu says a beautiful thing about grief that I think also deeply relates to how conflict works in our lives. And the beautiful thing about grief is that grief is something that comes in to us. And we are a container for it, and it's just passing through us. And we have to let it pass through. We have to let it move all the way through us. Because if we block it, if we trap it, if we hold it back, then it's going to get stuck, and other energy is going to build up behind it. And then we're going to try to push it out, and we're going to push it out with anger, or we're going to become depressed and locked up in it inside of ourselves and not know how to get out. And so we have to open that field. We got to open up our bodies and open up our energy and allow that grief to come out in a good way. And her support system for this, and this is the last part that I'll say about this amazing grief ritual that I highly recommend people experiencing from the Dagara tribe, is that she creates a support system with 2 altars. One is the altar of your ancestors, and the other is the altar of forgiveness. Now, the altar of your ancestors is your support center. Many of us look back at our ancestry and we think, wow, yeah, I don't know what happened to my ancestors, but it's probably some crazy stuff, and it's probably their fault that my family's so screwed up. And, they've just been passing this stuff along down to me. And we have a hard time facing the gifts of our ancestors. But, our own family line is not only our own ancestors. I mean, that branches out so far. But we have to look at all of the other parts of life and parts of the world that actually create us and make us who we are. If we take in plants and we eat these plants and these plants become our bodies, then some part of our bodies and our cells were just born because of those plants. And so in some way, those plants are part of our ancestry. Some of our deep spirit medicine, some of our our soul ancestors, and our families that have traveled with us through space and time across lifetimes. And of course, your parents, your parents' parents, your parents' parents, 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 that line is also essential to get to know and to get to understand in our lives. And to ask to come forward to help us work on our own lives, because if we can work out some of the karmas that they created, they're down to help us. And if we can work it out, we're going to be a lot better off because of it. And we can ask our ancestors for help resolving conflicts. There's a lot of wisdom that someone builds up in a lifetime or multiple lifetimes or in the spirit world with new vision once you get out of this bodysuit. So on the other side, you have the forgiveness altar, and forgiveness is also an essential piece of understanding conflict. It's a ray of light that can come in like water and wash you clean. When you can forgive someone, it's about washing it clean. It's like letting it go. It's going to be okay. And it doesn't mean that the wound goes away. It doesn't just mean that, like, okay, you forgive this person and you move on. You know, if you still have emotional energy going on inside, the mental idea that you just forgive them is not going to do anything about it. It has to be someplace deep inside of you that comes forth, that is this forgiveness. It's the desire to give back to the person, or the desire to give back to yourself, the gift that you deserve, which is to feel how you're feeling and be who you are, and be who you are no matter what, and to give the gift to somebody else to be who they are no matter what. That's the key of forgiveness, and we're going to come back to that as we explore a little bit further here. But this pretty much wraps up our ideas of the origins of conflict. If we look at all of the different conflicts that are happening in the world, where are they really coming from? Well, probably that politician who wants to go to war with whoever was traumatized in some way by their father, was taught that if dude, creates a problem for you, you get the gun and you go after the guy, right? And because that is the way we've been taught and the way that our society deals with conflict, that's also the way we deal with conflict on a political level and on a global level. And there are many, many sicknesses that happen in the world because of this incessant pattern of trauma circulating back to conflict, circulating back to trauma, circulating back to conflict. And meanwhile, everybody's supposed to just put on a smiley face when they're asked, "How you doing today?" And you just say, "I'm fine," which means you're pretty much fucked up, insecure, neurotic, and emotional. And the truth is that how many of us have said at different points in our lives, someone asks us, "How are you doing?" And you're like, "I'm fine. I'm doing just fine." And it was a lie. We lie. We lie all the time about how we're feeling. And it's a natural human thing, at this time in history, because the culture and the societies that we've been living in treat our emotions as weaknesses. And so we don't want to be weak and vulnerable to some stranger. We want to be strong. And so we say we're fine, and we're not fine, and we're not okay. And we ask people how they're doing, and a lot of times we don't really want to know. We don't really want to go to the depth of where they're at and how they actually are doing. So we got to find some other routes to get into this whole deal. We got to find other trails into the experience of where someone's actually going through their pain. And so what we can do is we can use our bodies as antennas and get to know that feeling that arises before conflict is occurring. We can notice it first in ourselves, when there's like a little bit of a misunderstanding or an argument, or someone says something and it doesn't feel right, like something's wrong about what's been said. And you sense it and you feel it and you're confused about it. And if some part of you is triggered by it because it didn't feel good what the person says, you have to be really conscious about how you're going to speak to that person or ask them about that. Because just revealing to them that what they said hurt you could trigger them. They're like, "Whoa, what do you mean? I didn't mean that? Like, God, why do you gotta always take things personally? And you never know what might be stored up inside that container. But that first feeling is the place that you gotta look for as that key to, is there gonna be a problem here? There might be. And that's the place where you have to start kind of looking at how you're gonna strategically deal with the situation in a new way. You also might see it if you're out at a party or at a club, you happen to be looking over at somebody and basically like you notice that this one guy's got this look on his face and there's this other guy and, or he's like drinking his beer and he's like working his knuckles or whatever, you pick up the physical field, you see the emotional field, you see the mental field, you know that conflict's gonna come. And if you can go and interject at that point, if you can intercept at that point, you can often stop and de-escalate the conflict. And a lot of times it takes, using skills like Aikido, which is all about redirection. It's all about changing the direction that the energy's flowing. So the guy who's working his knuckles over here, you go over to him and you say, hey man, what's up? Like, can I buy you a beer? Or you wanna go check this out? Or dude, there's some like cute girls over here. You wanna go check them out? And test the waters, He might be pissed off enough that like that little communication just ain't working for him. And he's like, well, what do you want? What do you want from me? I'm like, I don't want anything, dude. Just saying what's up, saying how you're doing. That's it. And sometimes just responding to that place where someone's in that zone with like total, it's all good. Like everything is cool and everything is okay. And I see that there's something going on with you and I don't have to say anything. I just recognize that it's there. I'm going to acknowledge that it's there and see if you want to go a different direction. Sometimes that's enough to disarm somebody. And sometimes their armor's too hot. And if you can tell beforehand that someone's armor is too hot and they've got too much energy built up, too much emotion built up they want to spill out, your best bet might be to go to the other person in the conflict and actually connect with them and try to rearrange or readjust the situation and get them out of the situation before the conflict escalates. Now, that's just the very, very first tip, right? And this is the art of finding alignment in the conflict. Where are you going to be in alignment? Are you going to align, yourself with the guy who's potentially more dangerous, potentially more going to create the conflict? If you can, then you're more likely to stop the conflict. If you align with the guy who doesn't really care or doesn't really know what's going on, unless you can get that guy out of the situation or girl out of the situation and completely away from the other person, the person that has the greatest emotional charge, the greatest grief, the greatest grievance to give, that wants to give his grief to somebody else, that person is the one that's holding the charge, and that's the person that's really going to determine whether or not a conflict is going to happen. And so that's the energy, that's the emotion that you got to try to work with and move in a new way. And there's a variety of ways of doing this. Asking someone to go have a drink with you, asking them to join you for something else, saying what's up, saying, hey, do I know you from somewhere? I think I recognize you. Creating distraction and just shifting the field, shifting the dynamic a little bit from wherever that person is frustrated, wherever that person is focused, and shifting it to somewhere else. Now, in a personal conflict, this can sometimes work if you look at the fact that, you've got some energy that's being built up and you've got something triggering you, and you just shift your attention and you say, okay, something's triggering me about this. I don't know what it is, but if I speak right now and I say anything back to this person, the charge that I'm feeling inside is going to be received. In other words, they're going to feel the anger, they're going to feel the frustration, and they're going to feel the arising of the conflict emerging for them. And so, and it may trigger them. It may ignite the conflict as soon as you say something. And so you have to look at that place where your own words, your own voice, your own tone, and your own energy are going to give away where you're at. And if you're triggered, especially with someone who's highly communicative, that could then in turn trigger this person. Now, some people don't like letting you off the hook. You know, like you've got a relationship, you got a partner, and this person is highly communicative. If you don't speak, or you hold back, or you try to kind of discharge and focus on something else for a minute, they may notice, they may try to dig it out of you. And so that's the real challenging spot, is can you let it out without directing that anger, that charge at that person? And this shows us something about that working with a third party person. You know, this guy's pissed off, you're trying to interject. Are they going to immediately now direct that anger and that energy that's built up towards you? It does happen. It can happen. So you have to be prepared for that. And if you realize that someone has been triggered by something that you have said, then you have to be cautious about how you dig it, and realize that it's not your fault. You know, they took it personally. That's okay. And that maybe you should be careful about the next things that you say, or how you say the things that you say, because you could escalate the conflict if you're not careful. And this is often what we do when we're in these personal relationships is, you know, we say something, we trigger somebody else, we see that they're triggered, we're like, why are you triggered? I didn't mean it, and like that. And then they're like, well, why are you mad at me? Because that triggered me and that hurt. And all of a sudden, you know, you're going down that spiral, and you're weaving your way into conflicts. But if you can stop and you can cool down, if you can redirect the energy, if you can create another situation, if you can change the topic, if you can shift it enough, then there can be a place where that energy has a space and a time to go through, to where when it comes back around and you address it again, it's fine. Notice in your lives, when you have conflicts with people, what does it take to resolve them usually? Like if you have a fight with your partner, usually it takes, you know, a certain amount of time. And once the time has passed and each person is able to process the energy that's involved in the conflict, they come back into conversation and it's all good. Everything's fine. You hug each other, you've resolved it, you work it out. Sometimes you got to go back and deal with the original issue a lot, you know, but there's not always as much charge, and so it's a lot easier at that point to actually resolve it and cool down the field. So how can we create more of that space in the moment of the conflict? You know, one of the things that my wife, Kyle, likes to say is, she's like, well, curiosity is a good way to start. And she's right. You know, if you can be curious about the conflict, curious about the nature of what it is that's coming up, and you can approach the situation, you know, even if you're getting triggered, approach your response with enough curiosity. Hopefully, your curiosity about what the other person has said won't trigger a further conflict. But where this gets really difficult is when there's already ingrained patterns that both people are experiencing. And now these ingrained patterns come back to this idea of our storage of grief, and how we release grief, and how we deal with our deeper emotional and energetic needs. And one of the most challenging situations that we can be in, that is a patterning process, where we're being shown over and over again that certain kinds of feelings, certain kinds of thoughts, certain kinds of words, and certain kinds of emotions create inevitable outcomes, inevitable from our perspective, is something that arises when we have someone in our lives that has borderline personality disorder. Now, borderline personality disorder is actually just a name for borderline psychosis. And it's generally just a name that's referring to something that almost every single human being has, which is a little bit of a level of ourselves that work through energetic control dramas. If you've ever read any of the books by Barbara Ann Brennan, she covers these 4 different control drama styles in Light Emerging. And in each of these different control drama styles, there's a different energy play that's going on, that someone is doing to attempt to take energy from another person. Now, why are they doing this? It's not because they're a vampire. It's not because they're evil. It's not because of anything that we could say really is a judgment on them. The reason why they're trying to take energy from other people to get their needs met is because it happened to them. They were shown by their parents. They were shown by their aunt, their uncle, their stepmom, their stepdad, whoever it was. They were shown that if you do this way, you're going to win. And you're going to get energy from this other person. And that's what we get trained as. We grow up in the worst kind of training imaginable, most people, which is the training on how to take energy from other people. Because we've lost the fundamental spirituality in a lot of our society and culture that informs us about the energy that arises inside of us, that shows us that we have to express our emotions and we have to open a space inside of us to get reconnected to ourselves and our source. And so we get into dynamics with other people and we begin to play out these energy drama patterns. Now, in the borderline scope of things, what you end up with is, they use these 4 different feminine archetypes, but they're really feminine or masculine. It's basically the queen king, who's basically going to demand and righteously enforce that a certain thing happens a certain way or else. That's it. That's final. That's the only way it's going down. And if you don't align, then so what? Then you're out. You're out. You're out of the kingdom. You're banished. You either align with what the king and queen says, or that's it. Nothing else. And this is a very intense strategy. On the other side of the spectrum, you have what's called the wave. And the wave is like so passive, so completely, wounded on the inside. They've been beaten, they've been traumatized, and whatever. They're wounded. They can't even come up with enough energy to do something for themselves. So they need other people to constantly be helping them, constantly supporting them, constantly giving them energy. And if they don't, they're going to get the biggest guilt trip in the world. And that guilt trip is specifically designed to seal the deal and get the energy exchange happening. And then a step up from the wave, you have the hermit. And the hermit energy is the energy of isolation because of fear of the outside world. And so the hermit parent will be like, no, you can't go play ball. You're going to hurt yourself. You're going to break your leg. Like when I used to play baseball, I hurt myself. And, once my leg was broken, I couldn't do anything after that. Or no, you can't go out and party because it's dangerous. And there's all these dangerous things. And if you go out there, you're going to be hurt and you can't do it. No, And the hermit's pattern is actually to create over time such a sense of fear of the outside world that they're no longer alone. That they're now afraid of everything out there in the world along with their child or along with their partner, along with the other person that's in their lives. It's a tough pattern. And the 4th pattern puts it totally to shame. The 4th pattern is the witch. And the witch, which is a bad name for it, because personally, I honor so much the word witch and the background of the witches, and God bless all of the souls and beings who have been traumatized throughout history because they were healers, because they were witches, because they were Wiccans, because they had medicine of the animals and the plants and the land. And this medicine was denied by the church and by religions at that time. So I will work on finding a better name for this, but this is just the name that's used in borderline psychology work. And so this person basically has been traumatized to an extent where they've been made to feel like they're the problem. They're the reason why their parents' lives are miserable. They're the reason why, dad didn't get that promotion. They're the reason why mom hasn't been able to get any further in her whatever, knitting. And because they've been programmed over their whole lives to see that they're the reason for all of these issues and all of these conflicts, they actually then eventually believe that they're evil, that they're bad, they're fundamentally bad. And so the only way they see how to make things work in the world is to be manipulated. They manipulate people into doing what they want them to do. And they can manipulate people by being a waif, by being a hermit, by being a witch, by changing form all the time. And a lot of times that's all coming from this place, this deep, deep place where they actually have this perspective that they themselves are evil in some way. Some deep fear that they are evil, that they're fundamentally dark, that there's something wrong with them. And some people deny it and shell it over, or accept it and actually decide that that must be their path. They must be this demonic being and they have to act that way to somehow survive their lives in the world. And it might be their only way of survival within their family dynamic. But it certainly comes to become quite an issue when they fall in love, or when they have friends that they care about and they have compassion for them, and they want to protect their friend who's going to be hurt, and they want to do these things that are good, which are in fundamental conflict with their self-perception that they're evil. Now, this is not rare stuff. These are things that a lot of us have elements of already inside. And this is why I bring it to the space of this workshop as we come into this last phase of the workshop, is that when somebody has one of these issues to a serious, serious extent, then what you can do when you're actually in a space of conflict with them is more and more limited, depending on the intensity of their situation. They're going to craft the situation. They're going to have all kinds of mental ideas and all kinds of ways and patterns of acting that are designed just to get you into that game with them. And then once you're in the game with them, that game pretty much has one conclusion. And that's that at some point, it's going to be so intense, it's going to be game over. And that game over is probably not going to end very well. So one of the best things that you can do is study these kinds of profiles and begin to understand these patterns so that you can step outside of them, so that you can give good reflections to people who have these needs and these traumas from their childhood that are not being met, that they're trying to play out through these borderline patterns. And if you can start to work on them and see them in yourself, if you can see, have you got any of those facets in you? And you can see it in your loved ones, you can see it in your friends. If you can see those patterns, you can begin to start to see how to work around them. You can begin to see how to support this person in receiving energy and getting energy through themselves and through the world and from the love of their friends and family, without having to resort to these borderline techniques of energy vampirism. So that's a big, big piece of study. And unfortunately, we're not going to have time to dive all the way into it today. But I wanted to arm you guys with that awareness because it's something that is very serious. And after my experience this weekend, I believe that there's a few really powerful tools that can work with that kind of experience, and grieving is definitely one of them. I think it's also possible that in certain kinds of ceremonies and certain kinds of medicine ceremonies in particular, there are conditions that can be created with the right kind of support structure for someone to see and realize these patterns inside themselves and actually go through an internal transmutation and a deep healing and actually come out of those patterns and stop perpetuating these cycles of conflict inside their lives. It may take time and it may take years, and it usually does. Life is a long journey lived, and when we take on programs for a very long time, it may take us a while to work our way out of them. But if we can see them consciously and we can identify what's going on, that's the first step to beginning to resolve it, to creating the space that's needed for that resolution to really happen. So let's go back to the 4 stages of conflict again. We've talked about the origins, where conflict arises from, how trauma is this fundamental trigger where that brings up different kinds of conflict inside of us. How the lack of food, eating too much sugar, caffeine, physiological states can actually be an origin of conflict, and the lack of release of grief. And grief that may have come from compounding on a variety of things, mental challenges, pressure, stress, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, emotions that are not expressed. And so when these feelings get expressed through anger, through violence, through intensity, and that conflict begins, at that point, we have to decide how we're going to align. Are we going to hold our ground here no matter what in this conflict, or are we willing to be flexible to meet someone in a new common ground space? Because it might not be what you think it is. The common ground might not be where you want the conversation to go. You might be protecting, you might be defending the place in you that's hurt, that's traumatized, that wants to be seen, that wants to have its emotions expressed. The other person might be sharing all kinds of beautiful stuff, but there's a place in you that's having a hard time even hearing it because of the noise of your own pain and the feeling of your own grief, your feeling of you're not going to get heard, this person isn't going to understand you, whatever that pattern is and that trauma is that probably came from your childhood, probably came from a period of your life when you're growing up and you realize that this person in your life is not going to listen to you and they're not really going to respond to what it is that you're feeling. And so you have to actually see that patterning in yourselves, and you have to be able to see that patterning in someone else. This person's not going to be able to let go of this conflict because their fundamental belief system and their honor, their themselves, they're holding on to it. And so if that's the case, how can you realign? How can you redirect the field of that conflict? And we do that through the process of tempering. And through tempering, we find ways to work with someone. We find ways to align with them, and then we find ways to work with them. And you know, another piece of aligning with someone is like if they have a different accent, they're coming from a different cultural background, they're coming from a different life situation. Sometimes you gotta fit in with them a little bit. You gotta come to that tough dude as a tough dude. You know, you gotta talk to that redneck that wants to beat that kid up as a redneck. You just talk to him about getting a beer, go do something else. You know, you gotta meet that guy who's like, you know, gonna start a fight and he's like downtown and this kid is just he's causing me all kinds of problems, man. You know, he's starting all this junk with me, and you're like, dude, all right, I hear you, man. That's some bull. Let's get out of here. Like, come on, bro. Let's go do something else. You know, you gotta meet people and align with that and that intensity, and then you can temper it. Then you can start tempering it down and be like, all right, man. You know, so like he's walking away with you. All right, just tell me what happened. Or like, forget that guy, forget him, forget about it, forget about that thing. You're bigger than that, dog. Like, you don't need to waste your energy on that. Like, come on, let's go have some fun. And you create some kind of connection with the person that's in the conflict. And now, if it's you that's in the conflict, the question is how can you stay connected to your truth and somehow connect to the other person's truth? That's the tempering process. So your truth is there. It needs to be expressed. They have a truth too. It might be different. Can you say, okay? Can you hear what they have to say and be like, all right, I hear that. That makes sense. All right, like I get it. I get that that's your perspective. This is the way that I felt in the situation. I understand that they're different. Like I'm trying to honor this way that you feel in this situation. I want to honor that. I want to resolve this with you. I have an intention of resolution with you, but I don't know how to get there. And in yourself, you're looking at it and you're like, I got to stay connected with my truth. And maybe I'm right and maybe I'm wrong. Sometimes you're wrong. Sometimes you don't have the right of the situation. Sometimes that guy that you're trying to address the conflict with, he doesn't have the right in the situation. You know it's wrong. But if you can get out of the field of the conflict, if you can temper it down and tamp down that fire to the point where it's just a smolder, now you're not going to be dealing with violence. Now you're not going to be dealing with like the level of intensity where you're screaming at each other. You can actually start to work towards a mutual dialogue. And that mutual dialogue is going to give way to that fourth phase, which is really the resolution. And sometimes resolution is just agreeing to see things differently than somebody else. You might just have a different perspective. That's okay. Maybe you don't know if you're right or wrong, and it's just going to take time for you to know. And if you're out of that intensity of the emotional conflict, like you're going to die if you're wrong, or this person's going to somehow control you or run your life or take your energy away, if you can get out of that state, then you're in a much better position to be wrong and to be okay with being wrong. But you got to get to that point, and that's the tempering process. You got to build rapport with the person. You got to build coherence with the person. You got to build love back with the person. And sometimes it can be hard to get there. The emotions are raging, the stuff is intense, and you got to temper it down with consciousness and mind and focus. And that consciousness and mind and focus is, how can I relate with this person? How can I meet them there? How can I find a place where we are in alignment together, where we are meeting in the middle? Where is that spot? How do I find it? Work to find it. And then when you see how to get there, start tempering the emotional field down and allow the emotions to come up and be expressed. How did that situation make you feel inside? And if we have a healthy emotional body, just sharing how that made me feel, how the situation made you feel inside, can help to release all of that trauma, all of that grief, and all of that conflict space that's inside of you. You might break down and cry, you might open up your heart, and it might be really hard. And you might hear from the other person how that made them feel and how intense that was for them. And you got to look at that and you got to face that. That's how they feel. That's how it made them feel. It doesn't mean it's your fault. It doesn't mean it's your fault that they feel that way. Even if you said something that made them, triggered them, that brought that up, that made them feel that way, it's not about fault. Okay? And you got to get past that point of the fault to the place where you realize you have feelings that need to get expressed and understood and received and held. They have feelings that need to be expressed and understood and received and held. That's the place that you got to share. It's the place where you both acknowledge that you have grief, and it's time to bring the good back to that grief. It's time to allow that grief to be expressed so that the conflict can come into full resolution. All right, well, that's about all we have time for today. It's about 6:05. I hope you guys have enjoyed this session. I've done my best to throw tools at you as fast as I can. We're going to have some awesome conflict resolution courses coming up in the Guardian Alliance next year. But we have a couple upcoming courses that are going to be coming into your space soon. So if you're not a member yet, jump in, get a membership, or just jump in the free course, and that'll add you to our list, and we'll send you updates. We'll let you know when we do the launch, and we'll do some big sales of stuff as it gets released and give it to you as cheaply as we possibly can and give you as much value as we possibly can, and always. And just love you guys so much. Thank you so much for being here, holding space, and letting me rant and ramble about conflict resolution. I hope that it's served you, and I pray that your grief gets to be expressed in your life so that you can know yourself more deeply and be more comfortable with who you truly are and all the feelings that are inside of you and all that you have to share and give as your gift to this world. Aloha ke akua, blessed be, in Lakesh, Ashe, Wobila, blessed be, and good night.